Well, we've had many progressive conservative summits, and I think the way it started yesterday was just great. I appreciate the energy that was on this stage, from behind this podium and with our panel. I thought it was just terrific, and I think they set the right tone in addition to having a lot of good intellectual content for us to consider. I always am eager to thank the people who make these programs possible. I want to thank our two partners. I want to thank Noreen Myers and the Progressive Women's Alliance for believing in this project from the get-go. I also want to thank Annette Kirk and the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, again, for believing in this project. And we've been doing this a number of years now, so it's been great having these partners. But it also works because of you. I think that to be able to pull off programs like this requires a faith in and a trust that we are doing our job to bring this community excellent speakers on very engaging, provocative topics that are sometimes uncomfortable to talk about. So I just wish to thank our members and our donors, and all the ways that you have helped the Hauenstein Center grow these past years that I've been here. So with that, I would like to turn the podium over to Scott St. Louis, who's the program manager for the Common Ground Initiative. Scott? Give him a hand.
Good morning, everyone. Well, thanks for braving the elements to join us for a full day of engaging conversation at the Hauenstein Center's Progressive Conservative Summit. We're going to begin with a presentation by one of the respondents from yesterday evening's event, but for those of you who were unable to join us last night, please allow me to introduce her. Angela Dillard is Associate Dean of Undergraduate Education in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan. She is also the Earl Lewis Collegiate Professor of Afro-American and African Studies and in the Residential College. Her research focuses on the political ideologies of both left and right, how they emerge, how they get deployed in the context of political movements, and how they change over the course of time. She is currently at work on a book, Civil Rights Conservatism, about unexpected alliances and intersections between the post-World War II civil rights movement and the rise of a new right. Her presentation today will focus on her research for this latest book. Please help me give a warm welcome to Angela.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here this morning and to be a part of this conversation. So Civil Rights Conservatism is the book that I've been struggling to finish these days. It's an extended meditation on race and ideology in the context of civil rights movements and the rise of the new right in post-World War II America. So from roughly the 1950s to the 1990s. Sorry. Let me say up front that I think we have quite a bit invested in seeing these two movements as distinct and separate. We assume that they share the same historical time and place, but little else. We encounter both movements in a modern phase, which is to say the post-World War II civil rights movement and the new right are embedded in much longer trajectories, the Black freedom struggle for the former and the long sweep of conservatism in America for the latter. In the post-war period, however, they're both struggling to portray themselves and to be portrayed as more mature, more coherent, more media savvy, less rough around the edges, and in a word, modern. For now, just keep in mind this general investment in the vision of these two movements as internally coherent and separate from one another. We'll see if we can throw a little mud on that pristine vision. I want to tell a few stories that suggest much less internal stability for these movements and much more disruptive intertwining between them in ways that I hope you'll find provocative. But first, a little more context and framing. There are two ways, primarily, that we tend to think about the relationship between the post-war civil rights movement and the rise of the new right within American conservatism from the mid to late 1950s onward. The first is through the lens of antagonism. The second is through a prism of co-optation. The antagonist lens envisions the civil rights movement as struggling against American conservatism, particularly its defense of the racial and racist status quo, and sees American conservatism defending itself against civil rights and equal opportunity for African Americans. This is sometimes called the backlash. Right? From this perspective, opposition to civil rights was at the very heart of what it meant to be a political conservative, especially, though not exclusively, in the US South. We could point to texts such as Richard M. Weaver's Integration is Communization from 1957 and the Southern Manifesto from 1954, denouncing the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education and pledging to withstand this, quote, abusive federal power. Though for me, the more provocative document is William F. Buckley's 1958 letter to W.J. Simmons, head of the White Citizens Council, thanking Simmons for sharing his mailing list with the National Review and assuring him that, quote, our positions on states' rights is the same as your own. All three documents are used effectively in by Nancy McLean in her joint volume with Donald Critchlow called Debating the American Conservative Movement, 1945 to the present. In her Equation of American Conservatism and the Defense of Elite Power and Privilege, she argues that modern conservatism was born from within, quote, the alliance that after 1937 united segregationist white Southern Democrats with Northern business-minded Republicans to fight egalitarian measures at home and ratchet up the Cold War abroad. What started as a revival of pro-slavery and pro-Confederate states' rights ideology via John C. Calhoun and others became first a club to beat back the New Deal reforms and eventually a shield to resist the onslaught of the post-war civil rights movement and the federal and executive power that made it possible. It was not only the appeal to states' rights, but also the defense of the right to discriminate that led political conservatives to resist the 1964 Civil Rights Act, even after Senate Republicans threw their crucial support behind the measure in the 11th hour. James Kilpatrick, writing in the pages of the National Review, put the matter succinctly in his assertion that the Civil Rights Act would, quote, undermine the most precious right of property, and that if a citizen's right to discriminate should be destroyed, the whole basis of individual liberty is destroyed. Appeals to the South with its peculiar institutions, such as slavery and Jim Crow, have thus been central in the conservative privileging of individual liberty over social equality, states' rights over federal power, and segregation over the dream of a fully integrated society. The second major way of thinking about what has certainly been a historically contentious relationship between the conservative movement and the movement for civil rights is through co-optation. This novel perspective calls our attention to the degree that conservatives, modern conservatives, contemporary conservatives, have become willing to configure themselves as the true inheritors of the values and goals of the civil rights movement, at least to this 1954 to 1965 incarnation, generally referred to as the good civil rights movement, before its 1966 degenerate phase as it descended into Black power. I've written extensively about this phenomena in the past, and I don't want to belabor it, but here's just a short passage from Patrick Buchanan's Right from the Beginning. Quote, in retrospect, the civil rights movement was liberalism's finest hour. If they have stumbled and blundered terribly since, they knew what they were doing then, and what they were doing was right. Many conservatives of various stripes and hues have drawn a sharp distinction between the civil rights movement and the later post-1966 and more contemporary civil rights establishment. Unlike its predecessor movement, argues Clint Bullock, a white conservative attorney and leading opponent of affirmative action, the current civil rights establishment has lost its moral authority of a universalist paradigm by favoring a particularist politics and thus, quote, transforming the meaning of civil rights from these fundamental rights that we all share as Americans into special rights for some and burdens for others. And you can hear a little bit of Mark Lila's own judgments kind of echoed in that passage. Some have regarded this as a gross and disingenuous misreading of American history, others as a full-fledged act of rhetorical subversion. But working between and within both of these ways of narrating the relationship between conservatism and civil rights, I want us to think together through a third position, one that sits in a potentially tense alignment with the other two, and one that takes us into the often murky terrain of political conversion or transformation. This is the one that can make us a little anxious. There are a number of individuals who might be said to have moved from somewhere within the universe of civil rights liberalism and a left-of-center politics to somewhere within the orbit of the new right and a political identity characterized as right-of-center. One of them, maybe, is James Meredith. I've been trying to make sense of his political life for years and to use him to tell a broader story about shifts within American political culture. He's a touchstone for me in general. He appears and reappears throughout this talk and across the chapters of the book project that I've been working on. In fact, the book began as a political biography of Meredith, who made history and who was made by history in 1962 in the wake of a successful battle to become the first African-American student to enroll at the University of Mississippi, which was then a bastion of white supremacy and racial exclusion in the U.S. South. He was catapulted to national and international fame, but even in the early 1960s, Meredith was a critic of direct action, nonviolent phases of the civil rights movement, and in later years, some of its major outcomes. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he has gone on record in opposition to quote-unquote forced busing, welfare rights, affirmative action, and ebonics. He's called integration a con job and has raised serious questions about its overall efficacy. He has, moreover, aligned himself with staunch conservative politicians, most notably North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms. He worked on his staff in the late 1980s, and ex-Klansman David Duke, for whom he campaigned in 1991 during Duke's run for governor of Louisiana. The book has become less of a standard political biography, which is a form I love working in, and more of a composite study of numerous individuals who share a similar trajectory. But it was born of my fascination with Meredith's dual status as a reluctant civil rights icon and as an often uncomfortably situated member of the loosely connected group of African-American conservatives who have struggled since the 1980s to remake the American right. Meredith is not the only compelling figure associated with the post-war civil rights movement who later underwent a political conversion. And I'm not exactly sure that that's the best way of capturing the fluidity of his political identity. Nor is Meredith the only prominent ex-civil rights activist to seemingly turn his back on the movement and its iconography. James Bevel, for instance, stunned a 1996 gathering of black activists when he rose to introduce reputed white supremacist Lyndon LaRouche as the man of the hour. Roy Innis, as executive director of the Congress for Racial Equality, or CORE, who also maintains ties to LaRouche, actively courted Republicans and conservatives. So too has Charles Evers, brother of slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers, and a longtime friend of Meredith's. Moving from the individual to the collective, CORE as an organization has undergone political metamorphosis and began to lurch heavily towards the right throughout the late 1970s and 1980s. The story of how one of the nation's oldest civil rights organizations and became presently little more than a right-wing front group is an important one in its own right. My point is that any number of examples of the supposed move of civil rights activists from somewhere left of center to somewhere right of center could be cited. If we were to expand our purview to include the Black Power movement, and CORE in fact entered the new right through an engagement with Black Power, then we could add several more, including Eldridge Cleaver. Cleaver's journey takes him from involvement with the Black Panther Party to exile in Cuba and Algeria to various alternative Christian movements after his 1975 return to the United States to ultimately conservative republicanism. Taken in isolation, perhaps each of these journeys can be written off as merely quixotic or iconoclastic, but unless we are willing to regard them all as damaged or crazy, we would do well to consider this phenomenon not only as a product of individual choices, but also part of a broader political and historical trend. Let me linger just a bit on CORE. Conventional histories of CORE generally say something like, quote, since 1968, CORE has been led by National Chairman Roy Innis, who initially led the organization to strongly support Black nationalism. Subsequent political developments within the organization led it to turn more towards the right. The suggestion here, and this is directly from Wikipedia, is that there's some sort of movement away from black nationalism, some change of policy that veered the group off the course of nationalism and towards the new right. The proper verb, I argue, is not so much change or away, but through. CORE became conservative and Republican through and because of its rendering of nationalism. Indeed, the missing link has got to be black power. So CORE, founded in 1942, helps to propel the post-war civil rights movement, and then it helps to propel the post-1966 black power movement, only to find itself once again at the cutting edge of black conservative politics. Wikipedia suggests that Innis started as a nationalist and evolved into something else over time during his chairmanship. But in 1968, he came out strongly in support of Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon. For Innis, this was about rejecting what he characterized as the paternalistic policies of the welfare state and the Great Society initiatives pushed by the Democratic Party. Better options for black advancement, Innis asserted, lay in Nixon's advocacy of community-based schools and policing, as well as Nixon's endorsement of black capitalism, especially Nixon's endorsement of black capitalism. There's not time here for a full explication of Nixon's views in this regard, but I can point you in the direction of an excellent piece by Robert Weems and Louis A. Randolph called The Ideological Origins of Richard M. Nixon's Black Capitalism Initiative, which argues that one can see its outlines in Nixon's philosophical linkages of African American civil rights with concerns about national security. Discrimination in education and employment provides fuel for communist propaganda, appears in a report from a committee he headed in the 1950s. So this, you can kind of trace the origins of this idea. And that Nixon's policies grew out of an interest in increasing the number of African Americans within the Republican Party. By 1968, the strategy was much more visible and powerful. At first glance, it might seem that advocating black power as black capitalism during the 1968 presidential campaign and subsequently throughout Nixon's presidency is at odds with the campaign's so-called Southern strategy. But for Nixon, they seem complementary. Advocating bootstrap capitalism as opposed to more federal welfare was, he hoped, not a particularly scary idea for the white Southerners he was working to recruit into the GOP. And in a campaign speech from April 1968, he says, quote, "What most of the militants are asking for is not separation, but to be included in, not as supplicants, but as owners, as entrepreneurs, to have a share of the wealth and a piece of the action. And this is precisely what the federal central target of the new approach ought to be. It ought to be oriented towards more black ownership, for from this can flow the rest, black pride, black jobs, black opportunity, and yes, black power in the best, the conservative sense of that often misapplied term." Richard Nixon and Roy Innis were definitely on the same page. Not only did Innis support mom and pop capitalism as a road to community control and black empowerment, which is hardly a novel proposition in the late 1960s and early 1970s in black communities, he also paired it with a rejection of state-backed and enforced efforts towards integration, which again is not exactly unique. Black nationalism is and always has been a major carrier of black conservatism, historically, and in the period between 1968 and 1974, the two were brought together in ways that exerted influence on the national political arena in and through the Nixon administration. Civil rights and black power activist Floyd McKissick, who we'll encounter a little later on, also supported Nixon, and the administration funded his Soul City initiative. James Farmer also threw his support to the GOP, running for an open congressional seat in Bedford-Stuyvesant on the GOP ticket in 1968 against Democratic challenger Shirley Chisholm. He lost the election, but joined the administration in what was then called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare before resigning 2 years later. For Innis, his support of the GOP was not at all transient. He certainly wasn't the only African-American civil rights figure to endorse first Nixon and later Ronald Reagan. For instance, Eldridge Cleaver did as well, on the grounds that Jimmy Carter had been such a disappointment to black people. But by 1984, after the years of intense debate about Reagan's racial politics, Innis was openly urging African Americans to support the GOP and Reagan, as opposed to clinging to what he called the sinking ship of Mondale and the Democrats. The successful desegregation of the Republican Party, Core noted at the time, can, quote, be one of the most important and healthy political developments for the black community and for the country at large. To make a long and complex story shorter, Innis and much of the membership of CORE believed in black entrepreneurship as a road to advancement and stood against school busing and affirmative action and gun control. A longtime member of the NRA, Innis, who lost 2 sons to gun violence, equated gun control with a form of racism that takes away the ability of African Americans to defend themselves. This is not at all atypical, again, right? These are not kind of unusual positions within African American political thought. We forget that the iconic picture of the Black Panthers at the California State House was taken in the course of their protests against gun control legislation. That's why they were there. That's why they were armed. Let me also quickly acknowledge that Innis has been involved in some unsavory dealings, including support for Idi Amin and charges of fraud and malfeasance. And yet I think Innis and the history of CORE give us a concrete way to consider some of the complex ways that civil rights and the new right are less clearly distinct than they're sometimes portrayed. My focus across chapters of the book is primarily on organizations like CORE and people like Roy Innis and James Meredith, whose political trajectories seem to straddle civil rights and conservatism, and who therefore afford us with the opportunity to think about the interconnections between the two, between and among 2 of the most influential social movements of the latter half of the 20th century. Sometimes this means exploring the terrain of political conversion. Other times it means exploring activists and intellectuals and opinion makers who were always critics of the civil rights movement and who in some cases went on to align themselves with segments of the right and the wider conservative movement. One can see this most clearly in the debate about the March on Washington. And yes, there was a debate about the March on Washington. Although these days it's become so heavily embraced in the American imagination that one wonders who they were marching against. The Reverend J.H. Jackson of Mount Olivet Baptist Church in Chicago and head of the National Baptist Convention characterized the idea as a dangerous rejection of law and order. And the increasingly cantankerous journalist, black journalist, George Schuyler, denounced the march and the movement as communist dominated. George Schuyler had already taken his conservative turn by the mid-1950s and thus always stood with those who denounced the movement as communist dominated and dangerous. That he did so through its column in the pages of the Pittsburgh Courier is just one reminder of the diversity within black political culture. Another is the equally prominent Reverend Jackson, head of the National Baptist Convention, for over 4 decades, and a fierce critic of direct action politically and of Martin Luther King Jr. religiously, ideologically, and personally. With some 5 million members in the 1950s and 1960s, the NBC, the National Baptist Convention, was the largest national organization of Black Baptists and one of the largest among African Americans in general. And he hated King with a passion. SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had to be created because Jackson barred King and his supporters from taking over the NBC. He opposed direct action, he opposed the March on Washington, and he was quite verbal about it during the NAACP convention held in Chicago just months before the march. James Meredith also denounced the march. He did so as a persistent symbol of the movement makes him especially provocative. His 1962 victory over the University of Mississippi officially desegregated that institution and firmly fixed his place in the pantheon of civil rights heroes. None of his criticisms of the movement seemed to matter or shake his hold on a reputation he deserved, but that he didn't want. His criticisms didn't quite register in the press, nor did they deter the movement's spokespersons from publicly claiming Meredith and his victory over Ole Miss as one of their own. Most dramatically, in his famous 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. expressed the hope that one day the nation would recognize its real heroes. Quote, "They will be the James Merediths, courageously and with a majestic sense of purpose, facing the jeering and hostile mobs and the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of a pioneer." James Meredith had other ideas. He saw himself as a different kind of pioneer. Concerning the proposed March on Washington, Meredith wrote, "I will say that in my opinion, the march would not be in the best interest of our cause. That cause," he insisted, "was best served by pursuing Black advancement through alternative means, specifically economic development, education, and what he called proper leadership." Indeed, it was to Meredith's mind, the very low quality of leadership, quote, "amongst our present Negroes, and the childish nature of their activities that constituted his great dissatisfaction with the movement in general." Or so he told the audience at the Youth Freedom Banquet at the 1963 NAACP convention in July. So this was quite a convention in 1963. Convened just weeks before the scheduled march, the proceedings were rife with tensions over tone and tactics. So it's a really great source material to return to. James Meredith may not be the most representative of present-day Black conservatives, but he received so much space and attention in my work because of the jagged trajectory of Meredith's career, has had a way of focusing the dramatic tensions and unexpected moments of alliance that separate and unite the post-war civil rights movement on the one hand and the conservative movement on the other. There are at present at least two James Merediths. The first is enshrined in photos, documentary films, textbooks, websites. In this eyes on the prize version of Meredith's and the nation's history, he is a clean-cut and determined young man whose slight build and often soft-spoken manner belies the intensity of his resolve. Indeed, striking photographs of a young and dignified-looking Meredith flanked by federal marshals and surrounded by crowds of angry whites is one of those visual images that help to solidify the meaning of the civil rights movement. This is a James Meredith of our public history, a man who lives only within the confines of our historical imagination. I was creating images then, in 1962, Meredith has remarked, that were designed for 40 years in the future. That future is now. The other James Meredith lives in the present, now in his late 70s. He has endured a lifetime of hardship and pressure as he struggles to raise a family, to live up to his own legacy, and to remain somehow politically relevant. This is a James Meredith who shocked those unaware of his post-1960 career by campaigning in 1992 for ex-Klansman David Duke. Meredith's role in the Duke campaign for governor of Louisiana was small yet significant. If elected, Meredith is quoted as saying, he, Duke, will be the best thing that happened to the Black race in 50 years. Meredith also allowed the Duke campaign to feature his endorsement in a half-hour television advertisement, highlighting the two men's shared rejection of liberal social policies such as affirmative action, welfare, and forced busing. The message was as clear as it was deliberate. If an African-American icon of the civil rights movement could validate Duke's politics, then neither Duke nor, crucially, his supporters could possibly be racist. In 1962, when Meredith risked his life, forced a constitutional crisis, and touched off a violent riot in his battle to enroll at the University of Mississippi, Duke was a gangly 12-year-old whose first fateful visit to the New Orleans Citizens Council office was still a few years off. That the torrents of history would bring these two men together some 30 years later and align them politically is a profound, if extreme, indication of the shifts within American political culture in the last few decades. Regardless of the distance he may want to erect between himself and the movement and between past and present, Meredith's confrontation with university officials, with Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett, and with the forces of massive resistance to desegregation transformed him into a potent political symbol. For better or worse, in the public mind and within the movement's culture, Meredith was a civil rights icon, despite the fact that even after 1962, when Meredith wasn't bickering with the movement's leaders and activists, both national and local, he largely ignored it. Meredith's criticisms of the movement in the early 1960s, some of which were public, but many of which were delivered in venues beneath the radar of the national media, have been largely deleted from public memory. Thus, many were understandably taken aback by his more recent denunciations of, quote, prominent blacks in the civil rights movement and the liberal elite as roots of black people's problems. Echoing the charges made by other African American conservatives, he now typically derides the, quote, civil rights establishment as a dangerous cabal of self-interested political entrepreneurs. They are making a living out of speaking for other people, they are making a living out of speaking for the people who don't have a voice themselves, he chides. The more people they have that don't have a voice, the greater their clout. They basically don't believe in anything but the promotion of the liberal ideology. But such criticisms do not represent a recent break between Meredith and the civil rights movement or the civil rights establishment. The seeds of this pattern of rebuke, I argue, were already planted in 1961 when Meredith first sat down at his Smith Corona portable typewriter to compose his request for an application to Ole Miss. Its outlines became clearer in 1966 when he returned to the South. He had graduated from Ole Miss in 1963, studied in Nigeria, and traveled throughout Africa, and headed north to attend Columbia Law School. He came back to Mississippi only temporarily to stage his Walk Against Fear. Meredith's 1966 walk helped to cement the vision of him as a quixotic loner. Here again, tensions between Meredith and the movement were present. Here again, tensions tended to go unacknowledged, at least publicly. Armed only with a Bible and a pith helmet, carrying an ivory-tipped walking stick of African design, Meredith and a few followers set off on a proposed 213-mile walk to promote voter registration and to demonstrate that a black man could walk across the state of Mississippi without fear of racial violence. Meredith did not consult any of the established civil rights leaders, nor any civil rights organizations, nor was he in touch with any of the movement people in Mississippi. By 1966, Meredith's tactics, a march, and even his goals, voter registration, were already, for many younger activists, anachronistic. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been passed in the wake of Bloody Selma, and segments of the movement were struggling to define a new agenda, one that went beyond securing of basic rights within a constitutional framework and towards a more overt notions of black empowerment and self-determination. In this emerging context, Meredith's walk seemed oddly out of step. Meredith did not get far. Shot and wounded badly on the second day out, he became once again a public symbol of wider social and political forces. Photographs of Meredith lying in a pool of his own blood stunned the nation. For assorted civil rights leaders, Meredith's situation was vexing. Having taken little interest in his individual and highly individualistic crusade, they were now compelled to act. Meredith was, after all, an important nationally and even internationally recognized symbol. Not acting would be interpreted as ceding ground to white supremacists. Hence, at Meredith's hospital bedside, Martin Luther King Jr. promised to continue Meredith's walk and to consult with him regularly on the march's progress and goals. Younger activists had their own ideas. A month before, Stokely Carmichael had won a hotly contested battle against John Lewis for the helm of SNCC. His victory connoted a new emphasis within the organization, stressing black consciousness and the building of independent institutions in the black community. Carmichael, still virtually unknown in the national media, along with Floyd McKissick, the recently elected head of CORE, saw the march as an opportunity to expose the nation to this new thrust. The march attracted thousands of people along the way, and managed to mobilize the apparatus of an increasingly fragmented movement for what would be the last of that era's great civil rights marches. It was fraught with difficulties from the beginning, especially because of the presence of the Louisiana-based armed self-defense group, the Deacons of Defense. Indeed, Carmichael used the nature of the violent attack on Meredith to justify the Deacons' participation. The march also provided precisely the type of public platform Carmichael and McKissick had hoped for. At this juncture, the story becomes less about Meredith's lonely, defiant walk and more the tale of the Meredith March. Once again, Meredith was rendered more myth than man. Although he did eventually rejoin his, or rather the march, its nature and context were radically transformed. By the time the marchers reached Greenwood, the halfway mark of the march and a symbolic turning point in the movement, Carmichael had managed to introduce Black power into the political lexicon of the marchers. This was not at all what James Meredith had intended. Having ignited a firestorm of controversy, he passed for a second time out of the public eye. Maybe there was in 1966 a year of Black power, but there was consequently no year of James Meredith. Still healing from the buckshot wounds that continue to plague him to this day, he returned to New York and began in earnest his long drift towards the Republican Party and the New Right. This long drift incorporated an attempt to move from protest politics to the mainstream political arena. In 1967, Meredith ran against incumbent Congressman Adam Clayton Powell at the behest of the New York State Republican Party. He returned to Mississippi in the early 1970s and launched numerous campaigns for local and statewide office, running sometimes as a Democrat, sometimes as an independent, but mostly as a Republican. None of these campaigns were successful. But what are we to make of Meredith's supposed political transformation, his turn towards the Republican Party, and his embrace of conservatism? And I'm not really sure the transformation, again, is the right interpretive framework. I think it depends on how you view what you think he was doing in the early 1960s. Some have offered the damage theory of politics as an explanation for Meredith's post-1966 career. That is, that he obviously suffered some sort of psychological trauma, or that he's just plain crazy. Others have written him off as a race traitor, a sellout, an Uncle Tom, a man who once did impressive things but is now merely embarrassing. Labeling him as, at best, a lunatic and at worst, a race traitor is understandable. How else to explain and perhaps explain away his apparent rejection of the contemporary civil rights agenda, not to mention his support of figures such as Helms and Duke? A similar and equally unsatisfying tactic applied to Meredith and to other difficult subjects is to render them as lonely iconoclasts who hear music in their own heads march to the beat of their own drummer. Similar assessments have been offered for Black conservative George Schuyler, whose long career spanned his work as a journalist, critic, and anti-colonial advocate in the 1930s and 1940s, and as a member of the John Birch Society in the 1960s. For Eldridge Cleaver and dozens of others, chalking up such an instance of political conversion to mere iconoclasm does not even begin to fully explicate it. But this tactic is safer analytically and more reassuring politically. Rejecting both of these approaches, I argue that while these sorts of explanations are perfectly intelligible, they are woefully inadequate and reflect the need for simple and often simplistic stories. Further, such truncated representations create boundaries that inhibit not only a fuller understanding of a political life like Meredith's, but also a richer and more complex vision of the movement that he has been so publicly associated with since 1962. Although my focus here is primarily on prominent activists and ideologues, the phenomena of civil rights conservatism should also remind us that African Americans in general responded to the civil rights movement in myriad ways. Some resisted the movement out of a fear of violent reprisals, while others thought that the time and energy would be better spent attacking problems of drunkenness, extramarital sex, and other manifestations of moral decay. Still others were gradualists made uncomfortable by direct action tactics, and some were, for various reasons, supportive of segregation. A 1966 study by Donald Matthews and James Prothero revealed that 1 in 3, quote, Negroes is not committed to the goal of racial integration, with 16% favoring strict segregation and 15% favoring, quote, something in between strict segregation and integration. This snapshot study calls our attention to the idea that the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle overall was not simply a series of confrontations between white segregationists and Black integrationists. Rather, at every step and throughout each of the eras, throughout each era, there was a certain degree of ambivalence and uncertainty as people were forced to choose among competing values and strategies for how to understand and how to act on the deep interconnections between race and ideology. I've also been playing around quite a bit with the distinction between integration and desegregation. The two terms are used too widely as synonymous, but their meanings can be quite different. Desegregation can be easily pressed into the service of a conservative politics, demanding only that barriers to equal opportunity, like racism and sexism, be legally and formally dismantled. Integration, on the other hand, implies a more progressive and affirmative approach to securing both an equality of opportunity and, to some extent, a meaningful equality of results. I argue that this key distinction is part of a compass of positions against busing and gun control in favor of forms of Black capitalism in particular, that served as outlets for African Americans who would come to align themselves with the Republican Party and the New Right. And what ultimately are we to do with these renegades? Do they offer us anything of value in terms of our historical interpretations and our understanding of our own very anxious present? Numerous civil rights historians have embraced the call for a long history of the movement. What I am suggesting here is that we think not only in terms of length but width. A wide civil rights history would have ample room for African American critics of the movement and the constitutive role they played in shaping civil rights discourse within Black communities and in American political culture in general. A wide history would not freeze figures such as Meredith in only one time and one place by taking seriously what happened next. A wide history would not flinch at the prospect that Black conservatism is one of the outcomes of the struggle for civil rights and Black power. And with that, I think I've done my provocative duty for this morning. Thank you so much.
We have around 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much for this really fascinating and exciting talk. My brain is buzzing with questions, but I guess I'll just raise a couple of issues, one broad, one more specific. You mentioned Joseph Jackson, but otherwise you didn't talk a whole lot about religion. And certainly in the narrative today of the dissonance between African Americans and the liberal movement broadly construed, commentators sometimes focus on the relative theological conservatism of many Black churches, particularly concerning issues of sexuality and gender roles. So I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on the role of that dimension of intellectual life. And second, more specifically, I wondered whether the Moynihan Report has come up in your research and whether some of your subjects reacted in interesting ways to this diagnosis of the quote, problem of the Black family.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. It's I actually do a lot of my own work on religion and political theology, and it's a big topic for me, and I thought if I started veering down that road, we would be here all day. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that I use the tensions between Reverend Jackson, no relation to Jesse Jackson, despite the Chicago connection, and Martin Luther King to really talk about what were differences in political theology, right? About how do you secure rights within the nation? Jackson favored a much more constitutional approach, much more legislative, much more gradual, that had been the dominant tenor of the movement in the mid-1950s. So the 1957, there's a prayer pilgrimage to DC, right? They're not going there to protest, they're going there to pray. And I think, what King represented, and the sharpness of direct action and that move, the idea that you would break the law and encourage other people to do it, was unsupportable for Jackson and many within the organization that he led, which is, again, one of the largest African-American national religious organizations, right? So this is no minor thing that this argument is happening. Jackson called King a powder keg, jackleg minister. I mean, he really hated everything that King stood for, and everything that the SCLC would come to stand for. So it's a really great site for looking at this debate and taking both the religious and the theological implications seriously. I'll just say about Jackson, this is really interesting. He hated King so much that when Chicago named Martin Luther King Boulevard, his church used to sit on that street, and he changed the front door of his church so it wouldn't be on his letterhead, right? I mean, he really thought that King was this dangerous figure. And in this, he was no different from other religious figures in the United States at that time. I mean, I think we really forget how hated and dangerous people thought King was. And so we would do best to think every time that we kind of read something about Martin Luther King, if we thought Black Lives Matters, because that's what it felt like to a lot of people. I mean, he was viewed as that dangerous, that outside of the mainstream, right, and that disruptive. The Moynihan Report, that's a really good question. I'm really going to take note of that and maybe try and spend some time teasing that out, right, as another place where debates about social policy were really playing out. I haven't really done that yet, but thanks for that. That's a good tip.
Did you want to ask a question?
Thank you. That was wonderful. I need to move this up a bit. One other thing that I think is significant with the J.H. Jackson contrast is that of how he emphasized, the gospel as personal salvation as opposed to social action. I think that's a significant difference between the two. And I think if I want to try to make a connection between last night's talk and responses and this one, I'm struck by, again, this matter of achieving the goals of liberalism, broadly defined, through government intervention as opposed to through the little platoons. And it seems like people such as Meredith and others who took the Black Power notions in a conservative direction, the big difference is, are we going to try to achieve these goals of liberty through government intervention or through the little platoons of family, churches, communities that are acting apart from government intervention? And another question is, it's right around the same time, in late '64, you've got the Johnson declaring the war on poverty, which again, a huge movement of government intervention that so directly affected the African American communities and in many ways mitigated against the little platoons. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, but I think that distinction can be analyzed and I don't think it was as dramatic, at least not, in the period that's the late 60s and the 1970s. And so I think if you look at the number of people who align themselves with the Nixon administration, I mean, they're still talking about using the power of government, right? So they're not yet at a place where they think that government itself is the problem. It's a certain kind of government orientation towards policies and action, right? So if it's to support Black capitalism, that's fine, right? If it's about, the Great Society, then they had a problem with it, right? So I think, you know, that this is a debate that becomes much more stark by the time you get to the 1980s. But I think that what interests me is the fluidity of that in this earlier period, and that the working out of what people really thought about the role of the federal government, especially, right, from when, in the context of the civil rights movement, in which to not think with federal intervention, it's just not even possible, right? I mean, nobody is going to say that Brown was a bad decision, right? I mean, and very few of the people that I've looked at have that critique of the federal government to that degree, right? I mean, so I think, again, that it's the mixture, it's the fluidity, it's people taking different positions at different times because they're trying to achieve different kinds of aims that interest me the most.
And I'd be interested, and again, you got another person to ask questions,
Yeah.
but what kind of government intervention were the black conservatives asking from Nixon and his cohorts?
Well, I think, you know, one place to look is Soul City, which, you know, I mean, actually I think deserves to be written about a lot more, which were kind of attempts to use some power of the government to literally catalyze more community-based movements around self-determination, so that you literally use government intervention as a catalyst to get this started, and then it kind of runs without the government there. Soul City didn't work, but I mean, I think it's a really good place to look for the real nuances and the real struggle for a different kind of alternative and a different kind of space for black activists that wasn't so tied to the Democratic Party and to Great Society initiatives.
Thank you so much.
They really thought were deeply paternalistic, right, and really problematic.
Thank you.
So, Professor Dillard, first of all, I want to tell you how great I think this project is.
Because you love that poster. Right?
Oh my gosh! It's fantastic to hear research where I mean, I didn't know these things about James Meredith, but one of the things I noticed is that when you're talking about these civil rights icons who then become conservatives, these are all men.
Yes.
And I don't know if it's a coincidence, but I'm wondering if that the conservatism, the kind of the thread that pulls through these decades has also anything to do with anti-feminism, patriarchy, ideas about the black family that carry over from black nationalism, that this is a conservatism that was already there. I mean, we know it was already there in black nationalism, and that this is also then what carries into their participation in the new right. I mean, I'm sure it is, but I'm just curious if that's part of your analysis too.
Yeah, I mean,
Thanks.
it's really, there's a real debate about, there was a piece, God, I think it was written in like the 1990s. It's called something like, "Why are all the black conservatives men?" I mean, where, you know, what explains this? So there are a few places that I've been looking. Certainly within CORE as an organization, there were a lot of women activists on the local level, right? And so that you can kind of capture a little bit of it there. And I think you're exactly right about this deeply patriarchal orientation towards the family and community. The other place, and I didn't really talk about it in this talk, is around abortion and anti-abortion politics, and the strong sense within black communities that you have to resist abortion in the same way you resisted slavery, right? Because it's about personhood, right? And that the implications of this for black communities was really strong and profound. And again, I think this is another thing that has been oddly erased from history, right? But because it's kind of inconvenient and it doesn't fit into kind of, you know, the sort of memes and models that we carry around in our heads, we really forget that Jesse Jackson, up until the time that he made a serious bid for the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party, was very anti-abortion And he made this analogy to slavery a lot, that we can't risk the unborn lives of black children, right? But because they're not going to be regarded as fully human and fully people. You know, and that was a really profound moral argument that he then has to change his mind, and then kind of history marches on in this ideological way that really obscures this. That's actually one way that you can kind of get in more voices of women, right, into this emerging presence of black conservatives. I mean, they tend to be more focused there, but thanks for that question. Hey, Andrew.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Can't wait for the book, no pressure.
Me too, I can't wait to read it. I always say that. Yeah.
So it's no secret that the overwhelming majority of African Americans vote Democratic. And I've always assumed that there were two mutually reinforcing reasons for that. One is that since the Civil Rights Movement, the Republican Party has pitched itself against many elements of the Civil Rights Movement to attract white majorities, especially in the South and elsewhere. But also that African Americans have largely been supportive of the broad array of social welfare programs that they think of as making their lives potentially better. And again, that these are mutually reinforcing reasons for supporting the Democratic Party. So would you say that your look at black conservatives emerging from the Civil Rights Movement is a study of an exception that sort of proves the rule, or would you say that it complicates that sort of tidy narrative I just presented, and that if, just thinking in vulgar electoral terms, the Republican Party could disentangle itself from the stain of racism, that many black Americans would vote Republican?
I think that's right. I mean, so I think both of those things, I'm trying to tell a story that's not as tidy, right? To, you know, how disruptive can you be, right? To get people to just rethink some assumptions that just aren't historically as valid, right, as people might assume. I think you're absolutely, I mean, I personally, you know, have been following the GOP for years in this attempt to reform itself, right? And again, it's just been kind of era after era of trying to figure out how to do this. Most recently, this was in the Republican autopsy from, you know, what went wrong in 2012. And they talk again about the need to be able to incorporate minorities, right, to kind of fix this problem that they have about the embrace of whiteness in a way that isn't really incorporative and inclusive of other kinds of positions. I mean, the Republican Party has done this over and over and over and over again. I think they're right about the need to become more diverse and inclusive. But every time that they kind of publish this or say it, they manage to then shoot themselves in the foot and can't, therefore, really appeal to larger numbers of African Americans. And this is, you know, becoming a problem with Latino voters as well. So I think it's a really interesting tick, but that the problem is the Republican Party itself, right? That they can't figure out how to speak in a different language and how to embrace a different kind of politics, right? And until they do, they won't get to the number that they need to get to, which is not huge, by the way. Right? You don't need everybody. You need to maybe claim about, I don't know, 20% of the African American vote, and Democrats can't be elected. I mean, again, it's just, you know, they don't have to do a lot. They just have to do enough, right, to make themselves less the party of racism, frankly, right, you know. And I do think that they have, you know, some views and some policies that would be really attractive. Every once in a while, I get a call from a Republican organization that they want to consult about how they can pull this off. And I'm like, no, I play for the other team. So it's really funny, yeah. But I think you're right. It's a really interesting thing to think about whether or not this is going to be possible for the GOP, right? Even though we know that they haven't gotten there yet. Can we do last two and then, great.
Hi, I was thinking about your talk about Meredith, and he would be the kind of person that would enroll in Ole Miss. as a conservative, because I can't imagine Stokely Carmichael or any of the Black Power guys wanting to enroll in Ole Miss so someone could learn them, you know. They're the guys that called MLK the, you know, fuddy-duddy old, you know, Tom, you know, guys. So they would not be the conservative, thoughtful person that would want to enroll at a university. But my real question is about black capitalism. It seems to me, from my, you know, reading less than you and living through that period, that it was black capitalism that enraged the people that, you know, ran the blacks out of town more than demanding their rights. They was the small stores and shops and taking the economic reins that really got them in trouble a lot more, with shops smashed and people run out. So that's my question. Seems like that's not a solution as much as it was a problem back then.
Oh, the mom and pop capitalism itself was, yeah, that's really interesting. It's also interesting too to think about, you know, I think now we can look back and ask the question, was Meredith's fight against the university in 1962 kind of conservative, right? So in 1962, that makes no sense, right? I mean, that's not possible in the American political landscape to conceive of that as a conservative act. Meredith himself says that, you know, part of what he's fighting is white supremacy itself, right? Because it creates artificial barriers to exceptional people like him. So I think, you know, at best what you could do is to say that there's an exceptionalism at work, you know, when you look at Meredith and maybe some other people who are fighting those really early battles, right, to desegregate institutions. Some were only trying to desegregate institutions, but others were trying to be the first person who was then going to pave the way, right, for everyone else, right, in this really expansive notion of what an integrated institution might actually look like. So I think that tension is really kind of fascinating. I'll have to think about the one about the tensions around black capitalism in that sense. I think that's really interesting, though. Thank you for that.
Nice discussion, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering, when you were thinking about doing this project, starting to write your book, what were your motivations with it? To clarify some ideas that you were sure about, or clarify some ideas that you think the society was confused about? Or what were your motivations? I'm really interested in knowing that.
Yeah, so my first book, which, you know, now is some years ago, I wrote the book that I wanted to read. So it's a book about political conservatism among African Americans, Latinos, women, and homosexuals. It's because it seemed to me that, you know, that there was a kind of incomplete story, right? And people kind of weren't really talking about this question. And what really interested me is to say that identity and ideology, that identity doesn't determine ideology, right? That there were other ways that people thought about these questions, and that this idea that somehow they're self-hating or sellouts just seemed to me wrong, right? And just seemed to be not the right way of characterizing the complexity of political life. So it's a story I really desperately wanted to tell. With this recent project, I think it's a kind of recovering of a history that's been lost. And so I think that's really interesting as a historian and as somebody who specializes in ideology. I also think that we need to think in broader and more complex ways about the civil rights movements, about race, about inclusion, about ideology, where people stand. I think we need a better vision of black political culture as really rich, and that there are arguments and people do not agree. And right, that's what it means to take that seriously, is to let the arguments sit, right? Let them breathe, and that's okay, to be able to accept that, even if we disagree with some of it politically, and I do. But, you know, to kind of erase it seems to me to be really damaging, right? And not about being mature. And I think, you know, at this time, we really need to be much more mature in how we think politically. And then it's just kind of fun So I was at a March on Washington 50th anniversary commemoration right in that moment, presenting some of this argument that there were center to right African American critics of the civil rights movement. And people, it was just jaw-dropping. I mean, people just had not, it's just not remembered. It's not there for us anymore. And that was really fun. There was this one, I'll tell this really quick story and then I'll get off the stage. This one older African-American gentleman, and I could just see his face as I was, gleefully talking about this history and the complexity. And so he raises his hand and he says, "You seem like such a nice, smart young woman. Why the hell would you be spending your time writing on this stuff?" He's like, "Why would you be doing this?" He's like, "This isn't doing anyone any good." And in fact, my own parents sometimes ask me that question. But I think the answer really is that we should embrace it, and that embracing it can make us better. It can make us think better, can make us argue better, can make us more empathetic, more understanding about political complexity. And again, I think that this is a time where we need truly, sincerely complex stories about politics. And as I argue, a civil rights history that is as wide as it is long. So thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.